When Loretta Lynn died in October 2022, the world of country music turned to one voice to carry her legacy forward: Patty Loveless. For decades, Patty had been seen as the natural heir to Loretta's Kentucky mountain sound. Now at 68, she's finally speaking openly about what that legacy meant to her and why she held on to it so quietly for so long. Their bond wasn't built on headlines. It came from shared roots, shared values, and a deep understanding of what real country music sounds like. Loretta recognized something in Patty early on, and the industry did too. Her voice carried the same raw honesty, the same power that had made Loretta a star. As tributes poured in after Loretta's death, Patty's words and performances revealed something unspoken between them, a passing of responsibility, and for the first time she's letting the world in on it. Before they ever shared a stage, Loretta Lynn and Patty Loveless were shaped by the same world. Both were born in eastern Kentucky coal country, Loretta in Butcher Hollow in 1932, Patty in Pikeville in 1957. These weren't just small towns, they were tight communities built around coal mines, church gatherings, and songs passed down through families. In those hills, music wasn't entertainment, it was identity. Loretta grew up singing in her family's home, learning mountain ballads that stretched back generations. Her voice carried the sharp edges and unvarnished emotion of rural life. By the early 1960s, that sound broke through the Nashville establishment. She sang about women's lives with a directness that was unheard of on country radio at the time. Her songs came straight from the coal towns, and audiences recognized it immediately. She didn't imitate anyone. She brought the sound of Kentucky's hollers to the national stage. 25 years later, Patty Loveless followed a similar path. She grew up surrounded by the same Appalachian traditions: gospel harmonies, fiddle tunes, and story songs sung on front porches. Her father worked in the coal mines, just like Loretta's. She started singing as a child, learning harmony from her brother Roger, who later became her manager. Those early years forged a style that couldn't be taught in studios. It was inherited, lived, and absorbed through daily life. When Patty moved to Nashville as a teenager, she entered an industry that had already been transformed by Loretta's rise. But while trends shifted toward smoother, more commercial sounds through the 70s and 80s, Patty carried something unmistakably traditional in her voice. She didn't need to mimic Loretta. The similarities were organic. They were both products of the same cultural soil. Industry insiders noticed the connection almost immediately. When Patty began performing at the Grand Ole Opry and releasing her first singles, critics drew parallels to Loretta's raw emotional delivery and unpolished strength. Country radio programmers described her sound as mountain soul, a term that had been used to describe Loretta decades earlier. It wasn't branding, it was recognition. This shared Kentucky lineage became the backbone of their connection. Loretta had opened the door for women from the mountains to step into Nashville without shedding their roots. Patty walked through that door with complete authenticity. She didn't modernize the sound to fit trends, she refined it, proving that it could thrive in a new era without losing its character. Long before Patty ever paid tribute to Loretta publicly, their bond existed through these shared origins. One woman brought the mountain sound to the world. The other ensured it didn't fade. That unbroken line spanning 2 generations and the same Kentucky hills set the stage for everything that followed. By the time Patty Loveless arrived in Nashville, Loretta Lynn had already reshaped country music. She wasn't simply another star. She had become the standard bearer for authenticity at a time when the genre was being pulled in every direction. Through the 1960s and 70s, Loretta's songs gave rural women a voice on national radio. She wrote and recorded about real marriages, poverty, motherhood, jealousy, and resilience, refusing to soften her stories for commercial comfort. That blunt honesty made her a cultural touchstone. Loretta didn't just protect that sound on records. She protected it in the industry. She became a powerful presence backstage at the Opry, at award shows and on tours, setting expectations for the generation that followed her. Newcomers learned quickly that Loretta valued truth in performance above everything. She expected singers to mean every line. That attitude shaped the atmosphere behind the scenes for decades. She also championed women at a time when opportunities were scarce. Loretta shared her stage with younger artists, giving them exposure they couldn't buy. She invited them on tours, introduced them to established audiences, and encouraged them to lean into their individuality. Tanya Tucker spoke publicly about Loretta's tough love in her teenage years. Reba McEntire has credited Loretta with setting a fearless example that allowed her to find her voice. Crystal Gale, Loretta's sister, followed her into the industry and often mentioned how Loretta pushed her to stand tall in spaces dominated by men. Loretta was equally outspoken in defending the traditional sound when the industry began tilting toward crossover hits in the late 70s and early 80s. She told reporters and CMA audiences that the music risked losing its core if artists abandoned their roots. She wasn't nostalgic, she was protective. For her, country music wasn't a trend to be reshaped for radio. It was a cultural language that needed guardians, and she took that role seriously. Beyond the public statements, Loretta created a culture of expectation among women performers. Younger singers watched how she handled producers, executives, and critics. They saw her refuse to dilute her message, and many modeled their own careers on that strength. Loretta's mentorship wasn't a formal program. It was influence through example, reinforced over hundreds of shows and countless encounters backstage. This role as cultural guardian wasn't temporary. Even into the late 80s and 90s, Loretta maintained a strong presence in Nashville's traditional circles. She appeared regularly at the Opry, gave interviews defending the purity of the sound, and supported performers who stayed true to it. By then, Patti Loveless was rising fast, and Loretta's watchful presence mattered more than ever. She wasn't just a legend Patti admired from afar, she was the force that shaped the environment Patti stepped into. Patti Loveless arrived in Nashville during a period of transition. The late 1970s and early 80s saw country music pulled between two forces: commercial polish on one side and traditional mountain sound on the other. She entered this world as a teenager, determined but unpolished, with a voice that didn't sound like what radio was chasing. But it carried something unmistakable. She signed with MCA Records in the mid-80s, and her early recordings made it clear that she wasn't interested in chasing trends. She was bringing a sound that cut through the studio gloss. Her first single, Lonely Days, Lonely Nights, released in 1985, made modest chart progress, but industry insiders noticed her phrasing and tone. By the release of Timber, I'm Falling in Love, in 1989, Patti had broken through in a way that didn't rely on crossover appeal. The song hit #1 on the Billboard Hot Country Songs chart, and her performance style, direct, rooted, emotional, stood out in an era increasingly defined by image-driven marketing. She followed it with a string of hits like Chains and I'll Never Grow Tired of You, establishing her place in Nashville not as a pop country star, but as a vocalist with weight. The Grand Ole Opry became an early proving ground. When she made her debut, the response was immediate. Veteran musicians and producers recognized a sound they hadn't heard at that level of authenticity in years. She didn't need to invoke tradition verbally, it came through every note. Within a few years, she earned induction into the Opry family in 1988, a signal that the industry's most traditional institution saw her as part of its future. Critics responded in kind. Reviewers in publications like Billboard and Country Music Magazine highlighted her vocal control, mountain timbre, and emotional delivery, drawing direct comparisons to the genre's classic voices. She wasn't billed as a Loretta Lynn imitator. She was seen as a natural successor to that lineage. The media didn't manufacture the link between the two women, the music did. Behind the scenes, Patti's rise aligned with a growing hunger among traditionalists for artists who weren't abandoning the roots of the genre. She became a favorite among older Opry members who felt the industry was shifting too fast. Her willingness to stand on those historic stages and deliver songs without modern polish earned respect quickly. She wasn't seen as a newcomer learning the ropes. She was treated as someone who understood what came before her. Her rise was steady, not explosive. That deliberate progression gave her credibility with both the industry's veterans and its core audience. While others leaned into radio trends, Patti doubled down on the sound that had shaped her upbringing. She wasn't trying to revive the past, she was continuing it. And that's what caught Loretta Lynn's attention in a way few other new voices did. As Patti Loveless established herself through the late 1980s and early 90s, her path began crossing with Loretta Lynn's on some of country music's most visible stages. These weren't staged publicity stunts. They were moments where two generations of Kentucky-born singers occupied the same space, representing the continuity of a sound that had shaped the genre for decades. Award shows were often where these interactions first took shape. The Country Music Association and the Academy of Country Music regularly paired younger performers with established legends in the late 80s to highlight lineage within the industry. Patti's growing reputation as a traditionalist made her a natural choice for appearances connected to Loretta. At tribute concerts and televised Opry specials, she was invited to sing material that had defined earlier eras, often stepping into songs that Loretta had popularized. These performances weren't framed as imitation, they were framed as preservation. One key moment came during anniversary celebrations at the Grand Ole Opry in the early 90s. Loretta appeared as one of the headliners, and Patti joined the lineup as part of a new wave of performers keeping traditional sounds alive amid the rise of country pop. While Loretta commanded the stage with her usual confidence, Patti's performance that night drew praise from veteran musicians backstage, who remarked on how naturally her voice fit alongside the classics. Loretta publicly acknowledged Patti's talent in interviews tied to the event, emphasizing how important it was that the real sound continued beyond her generation. Their shared appearances continued through the decade. Patti performed on programs honoring Loretta's milestones, including televised tributes and Opry retrospectives that looked back on Loretta's groundbreaking career. Rather than being slotted as a mere guest, Patti was often positioned as a bridge between eras. Her presence wasn't symbolic, it was functional. She could stand on stage after Loretta and deliver a song with the same emotional weight, connecting older audiences with a younger performer who honored the same traditions. Loretta also took the time to recognize Patti in interviews. When asked about newer artists who represented the genre's roots, Loretta consistently mentioned Patti by name. She praised her voice, her song choices, and her refusal to compromise stylistically. This wasn't empty flattery. Loretta rarely singled out performers publicly unless she genuinely respected what they stood for. Her endorsements carried weight across the industry. For Patti, these moments were public confirmation of something audiences already sensed. She wasn't just following in Loretta's footsteps. She was walking beside her, upholding a standard Loretta had set decades earlier. These shared stages and acknowledgments made their connection visible, not as mentor and student in a private setting, but as two professionals linked by sound, heritage, and purpose in full view of the country music world. As country music surged into the 1990s, the genre split more clearly between commercial crossover acts and traditionalists. Patti Loveless positioned herself firmly on the traditional side without turning it into a marketing slogan. She didn't announce her intentions in interviews. She let her discography make the case. After establishing her presence with MCA Records, she signed with Epic in the early 90s and entered what many critics consider her strongest creative period. Albums like Only What I Feel 1993, When Fallen Angels Fly 1994, and The Trouble with the Truth 1996 weren't calculated nostalgia pieces. They were contemporary records built on unshakable country foundations, fiddles, steel guitar, and vocal phrasing that drew direct lines back to the Appalachian sound she'd grown up with. Her song selections often leaned toward emotionally complex material, mirroring the narrative intensity that had defined Loretta Lynn's songwriting decades earlier. These choices set her apart during an era when many of her contemporaries embraced pop country hooks to court a broader market. While radio began favoring polished crossover sounds, Patti held to arrangements and vocal deliveries that emphasized roots. Critics repeatedly described her as a voice from another era living comfortably in the present. She didn't chase trends, and she didn't frame herself as a rebel. She simply stayed the course. Industry response reflected that consistency. Patti won the CMA Female Vocalist of the Year award in 1995, a period dominated by pop-leaning artists. That recognition came not because she adapted to the mainstream, but because she anchored herself in something enduring. Performances at the CMA Awards and Opry broadcasts reinforced that impression. While production styles shifted around her, she remained a stable point of reference, proof that the traditional sound still commanded audiences when delivered with conviction. Collaborations reinforced this role. Her duets with Vince Gill, particularly When I Call Your Name, and later collaborations on tribute projects, became emblematic of how modern Nashville could still honor its roots without turning backward. She appeared on albums paying tribute to classic country icons, and participated in television specials that positioned her alongside legendary voices, not as an imitator, but as a peer carrying the torch forward. Throughout this period, Loretta Lynn remained a revered figure, and her public praise of Patti solidified the perception that Patti represented continuity. Loretta didn't hand down her sound in a private conversation. Patti absorbed it through shared culture and turned it into her own body of work. That quiet inheritance defined her role in the industry. She didn't claim to be a torchbearer, she simply became one. By the end of the decade, Patti Loveless occupied a rare space in country music. She was commercially successful, critically respected, and seen as a living bridge between eras. Without ever declaring it, she embodied the very qualities Loretta had spent a career defending. Loretta Lynn's death, on October 4, 2022, marked the end of one of country music's most defining eras. Tributes emerged immediately from every corner of the industry. Artists young and old spoke about her fearlessness, her storytelling, and her impact on the genre's identity. For Patti Loveless, Loretta's passing carried a deeper weight. She had spent decades continuing the traditions Loretta had built, often without drawing attention to the connection. In the weeks following Loretta's death, that quiet link came sharply into focus. The Country Music Association quickly began planning how to honor Loretta at its annual awards show. When organizers considered who could stand on that stage and represent the sound Loretta had devoted her life to, they turned to Patti. She had largely stepped back from regular touring by that time, making her appearance even more significant. Her involvement wasn't just a tribute, it was a statement about lineage. Patti performed You'll Never Leave Harlan Alive alongside Chris Stapleton during the 2022 CMA Awards broadcast. The song, with its stark Appalachian imagery, wasn't chosen for commercial appeal. It was chosen because it reflected the cultural roots that Loretta and Patti shared. As the performance unfolded, the reaction in the room shifted. It wasn't nostalgia, it was reverence. Viewers recognized in Patti's voice the sound that had defined Loretta's rise decades earlier. Critics singled out the moment as one of the most powerful of the night, noting how Patti's delivery carried emotional weight that didn't need explanation. In subsequent interviews, Patti began speaking more openly about Loretta's role in shaping her understanding of the genre. She emphasized how much Loretta had meant to her personally and professionally, describing her as a figure who set the standard for truth in country music. She didn't fabricate private stories or embellish their interactions. Instead, she articulated what had always been clear in her music. Loretta had influenced her approach to artistry in ways she had carried quietly for years. This period marked a subtle but meaningful shift. For decades, Patti had embodied Loretta's legacy through her songs and career decisions without explicitly narrating it. After Loretta's death, she began to give language to that inheritance. The backstage secret, the unspoken passing of responsibility between generations, surfaced not as a dramatic reveal but as a fact finally stated plainly. Patti acknowledged what many fans and peers had long sensed, that she had felt entrusted to keep a particular sound alive. That moment didn't come with ceremony. It came through a song, a voice, and the weight of history meeting the present. For the first time, the torch Loretta carried so fiercely was not just implied through Patti's work. It was publicly recognized, closing a circle that had started decades earlier in the hills of Kentucky. Patti Loveless never announced herself as Loretta Lynn's successor. She didn't have to. Through decades of performances, recordings, and choices, she carried forward a sound that didn't belong to marketing strategies or trends. It belonged to a cultural lineage that began in Kentucky's hills and reached the world through Loretta's voice. When Loretta was gone, the weight of that lineage became unmistakable. The backstage secret wasn't a whispered confession. It was the unspoken responsibility passed from one generation to the next. A legacy built on truth, resilience, and music that refuses to bend. At 68, Patti finally named what her career had already proven. Country music changes, but its foundation depends on artists who understand what came before. Loretta was that foundation for her generation. Patti became it for the next. Their connection wasn't built in a single moment. It was written across decades of songs that kept a tradition alive. For more emotional stories, check out this video.